Um, Welcome, my friends. We're doing our Gemara share on Bava Kamma, and I'd like to wish Margaret Kaplan long life for today's the Yahrzeit of her late sister, Ruth Bat Shmuel Rephael, and obviously we've been doing the share in dedication of Ruth ever since COVID. And Margaret, I just wish you not only long life, but a very, very happy and successful one as well. And I'm sure you miss your sister very much. And I hope in some way this year and the learning that we do can be an aliyah for her neshama. And just want to thank you for being not only a good friend, but really, really a positive influence on everybody that comes into contact. So, guys, without any further discussion, we were on the 102nd daf of Bava Kamma, and we were learning a succession of cases between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So the rabbis are teaching a different case tonight, and that is that if one gave his agent money and to buy wheat for him, and the agent bought barley with the money instead, or he gave him money to buy barley and the agent bought wheat with it. So what are we talking about here? It's like basically the agent is an entrepreneur, and he was supposed to have purchased the produce and sold it at a higher rate. The profit shared by himself and the one who gave him the money, the investor. So basically, there are two parties, and they entered into an agreement, a partnership, in which one of them provides the capital, the investor, and the other manages the enterprise. The agreement that they share any profits or losses, either equally, in other words, 50-50, or according to whatever terms they stipulate in the arrangement. It could be that the investor gets a 40% share in terms of the venture capital, or it could be the other way around, 40-60. But either way, we're talking about a business arrangement. So, in other words, if the agent, the managing partner who actually is involved with the day-to-day operations of the business, followed the investor's instructions, then basically the produce that he bought would have belonged to both parties equally. And any appreciation or depreciation in its value would occur to produce either a profit or loss, and both of them would participate, and accordingly, when it was later sold, they'd share the profit or the loss accordingly. So the thing of it is if the agent deviated from the investor's instructions, this is the case that we're dealing with. So, in other words, if you use an example, just say Gavin and I have a business together, and I decide, because Gavin's got great entrepreneurial skills, that I'm going to invest 100,000 Rand of the money, and he buys wigs or whatever the case may be, because he's an expert in that. And we agree that there's a certain product line that we're going to buy at a mid-price point, etc. And then for some reason, Gavin deviates from that without telling me. And what would the situation be then? Would we be able to share the profits equally, or does the fact that he deviates from the discussion that we have separate the arrangement? So that's the case that we're going to discuss here. So they're using simple agrarian currency. They're not talking about complicated products. You have an investor and you have an agent, and they both agree that the arrangement is that they're going to buy wheat. And here, the agent didn't follow the investor's agreement. So instead of buying wheat, he bought barley. Instead of buying barley, that's what we're talking about. So it was taught in one brisa that if the investment depreciated, it depreciated purely for the agent. Okay? And that is understandable. Why? Because he deviated from the instructions upon which he was given the money by the investor. So therefore, if he didn't keep to the arranged product purchase, then the loss is his. But the question is, what happens if it appreciated? So according to the first brisa, it appreciated purely for the agent. According to the second brisa, if the investment depreciated, it goes without saying, it appreciated purely for the agent because he deviated from instruction given by the investor. But if it appreciated for the partnership. In other words, both parties end up getting a share of the profit. Okay. So there's two. So how do we resolve the contradiction between the first and the second brisa? So in other words, in the first case, the agent reaps all the profits and absorbs all the losses of the enterprise. And he has to repay the investor the amount initially invested. So the first brisa maintains that since the agent deviated from his instructions, the investor is no longer considered a party to the deal, and the agent's transactions count only for himself. So accordingly, the agent acquires the ownership of all the produce that he purchases. He owes the investor for the money that he gave him. It's as simple as that. Now, there's a different brisa, the second one, that rules that although the agent actually deviated from the instructions by the investor, the reason why the partnership remains intact and the investor is still party to a transaction is because at the end of the day, they went into business together for what? They went into business together in order to make money. So if there was an appreciation and money was achieved, that's not deviating from the instruction of the investor, because the investor put in money in order to get a profit out. Okay? So he gets his 50% share. If there's a loss, then in that particular case, of course, the agent has to pick up the full loss because he deviated from the product agreement that he was going to purchase with the investor's money. And since he deviated, he suffers the loss. Okay? So the question is, how do you reconcile the fact that in the first brisa, there's an issue of saying, look, the deviation causes a separation in partnership because they weren't on the same page, or the second version that says, look, at the end of the day, the investor just wanted to make money. So even if there was a deviation, as far as losses are concerned, that certainly is the agent's responsibility. Certainly, as far as profit is concerned, the investor got his goal achieved. So how do we resolve the contradiction? So the Gemara says, look, there's an opinion by Rav Yochanan who said, there's really not such a difficulty, because this one, the first brisa, which rules that any profit accrues purely to the agent, reflects the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Whereas the second brisa rules that the profit accrues to both partners, and that reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Yochanan basically explains that the first brisa reflects the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that basically a deviation on the part of the agent affects acquisition for the agent. And the reason being is that if you remember in our Mishnah in 100b, this was 2 dafs ago, that we learned that if one gives a haberdashery shop wool to dye, and it was dyed red, and again, the deviation was that the service provider dyed it black, or the dye acquired the wool through the wrong color, etc. What actually happens then is, because it's changed the physical properties, it affects acquisition for the service provider. Why? Because originally it was based on the thief. So it's based on that pasuk that reiterates the term, if he stole, he shall return what he stole. In other words, there's this superfluous double mentioning of the stealing. And the reason being is that in order to return an object that was robbed, it has to resemble the same physical condition or the same physical properties as when it was stolen. So, for example, if it changes, then what happens is the thief or the robber keeps the actual item himself, and he gives the financial equivalent to the original owner of that article, because its physical properties have changed. So we say that if you're going to provide a service, as we learned in the previous day, and that you deviate by not following the customer's instructions, and you get red you get wool and you were told to dye it red and you dyed it black, or you were told to dye it black and you dyed it red, then that affects acquisition, according to Rabbi Meir, where the wool that was dyed the wrong color belongs to the haberdashery shop, and the financial recompensation is given back to the original owner of the wool. So the original owner isn't out of pocket, but that physical change affects acquisition for the service provider, because in a way he is a thief, in that if he didn't follow instructions and expected money from it, he's got a similar capacity as a robber, although he didn't do it purposefully. Okay? So here too, since the agent went against the investor's instructions, he's deemed to have actually stolen the funds. Because if I lend you money for a certain purpose and we have a business arrangement, you buy it for whatever you want to, that's not the agreement we had. You're stealing the funds. So therefore you acquire produce that you purchase with it as the agent, and basically he has to reimburse the cash equivalent back to the original investor. And therefore, if he acquires any profit from it, or he suffers any loss, at either way, it's the agent's benefit or the agent's loss. But the investor doesn't lose out, because according to Rabbi Meir, the agent has to reimburse the financial money that was borrowed. But the change of what was purchased affects acquisition for the agent. Okay. If you have a look, it was what we studied yesterday. If you remember, Rashi said whoever deviates from the owner's intent is called a robber. Okay? So it's the same thing if it's a service provider and you've paid for a certain service or goods and that was not what was delivered. And it's the same in the case when you've got two business partners and one partner does exactly his own thing for money that was meant for a different purpose. Okay, now Rabbi Yehuda has a different sort of opinion, because basically he says that a deviation does not affect acquisition. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda says in our Mishnah that if you give a dyer wool to dye it red and he dyes it black, the dyer doesn't acquire the wool. All he has to do is give the original owner of the wool has to give the dyer either the expenses for what it cost him to dye the wool, but not his usual fee, in other words, whatever the raw material expenses are, or the value of the improvement from the raw wool to the dyed wool, whichever is the less amount. Because what we learned yesterday is if you deviate from instructions or renege on a deal, you actually have the lower hand in negotiation. So all you can ask for is not your usual fee, but either the money you invested in the raw dye, or the difference in terms of what the market values the raw product compared to what you dyed it to, but whatever is the lower amount. Okay, so that the person that didn't follow your instructions certainly doesn't profit from it. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda even said there, it's not a case like Rabbi Meir, where Rabbi Meir says, look, the person that messed up on the color of the dye gets to keep the wool, and all he has to refund is the money for the raw wool. So because Rabbi Yehuda says there's no acquisition for the physical change, then in that particular case, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he doesn't view a contractor's deviation from his instructors as an act of robbery. And okay, so the agent used the investor's money wrongly, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, he hasn't stolen it. So the original term of the partnership remains in effect. And the investor, if there's any profit to be made, acquires half of the profit with his funds. So the investor is entitled to a share. But, and this is a big but, if the investment turns sour because the agent deviated from the agreement, he must absorb the losses himself. Why? Because he wasn't authorized to make this bad investment. He bears fair responsibility for it. Okay? But if it goes and appreciates in value, the partner is entitled to a share. And the reason being is because, again, Rabbi Yehuda is holding something very fundamental, is that when people enter into a business arrangement, they do it in order to earn money. So as long as the investor ended up making money, he's not going to complain if he's still part of the deal. But if he loses money because the agent didn't listen to him as per the agreement, he's not entitled to that loss. That's where they're coming from in terms of opinion. So, but Rav Yochanan's interpretation is contested, because remember, this opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is only a suggestion brought forward by Rav Yochanan's interpretation. It doesn't mean that this is actually how Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda actually rule. This is Rav Yochanan's interpretation based on studying the text and the fact that he is obviously, if you remember, Rav Yochanan is holding on such a high level that he was the at that generation he was the leader. And in fact, when we learned in Sota about the Gemara yesterday in terms of how davening works on the Shulchan Aruch, there was an opinion brought forward by Rav Yochanan and wasn't even contested in the Gemara. So you've got to know who you're dealing with. He was the head rabbi of the generation in Eretz Israel. So it's very likely that his opinion is certainly the one chosen, and if not chosen, certainly drew a lot of support. But not everybody agreed, because Rav Elazar objected to it on a different basis. Why? Arthur? All right. So what we said is that according to Rav Yochanan, there wasn't a difficulty, because the first brisa rules that any profit accrued goes purely to the agent, and that reflects the opinion of Rabbi Meir, because basically that any deviation from instructions of the partnership, the acquisition of the goods that were bought where the money was meant to buy one particular type of goods and was bought for other goods, it separates the partnership. And then what happens is the agent basically has to refund the investor back his money. So whether there's a profit or a loss, there's no longer partnership, because any deviation is considered robbery without permission, and therefore it affects acquisition of the material bought for the agent, but he has to refund the investor. According to the second opinion of Rav Yochanan, the second brisa has to do with the fact that Rabbi Yehuda says that a deviation doesn't affect acquisition, because at the end of the day, it doesn't sever the partnership in any way, because although he wasn't authorized to make the investment on that particular product, if the investment makes money, the agent can't get out of it by not giving the investor share. However, if the object or goods that were bought by the agent, if it deviates from the investor and he loses money, then that loss is for the investor, is not for the investor. The loss is for the agent on his own. Okay? Rav Elazar doesn't agree. He said, look, according to both opinions, both brises reflect the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And he said there's no difficulty. In the first case, we're dealing with an agent who was sent to buy produce for consumption. And the second one, we're dealing with a case where the agent was sent to buy produce for commerce. So according to Rabbi Meir, when we learned in the 101st daf that a dyer dyed the fabric red instead of black, or black instead of red, or he made a chair instead of a desk, the reason it affects acquisition for the person that didn't follow instructions is because physical change affects acquisition for a robber, but he still had to refund the client his cash back on the deposit paid for those particular goods or services. Okay. As far as the intent is concerned, that's for private use or consumption. As far as the second price is concerned, the agent had an investor, and the two are going to be partners for a commercial endeavor. And in that particular endeavor, it was for the point of making a profit. Just hold on a sec, guys. So, according to the second opinion with Rabbi Meir, when it's for commercial merchandise, it's a different case, because the only concern that the investor has was making money. So whatever the agent buys, as long as there's a profit and they can both generate, he's happy. If there's a deviation where the agent bought independently and there's a loss, believe me, the investor's not going to be happy. Then the loss is the agent's alone. So that also makes sense. Now, as far as another argument that goes according to Rav Elazar is there's a general objection by the sages in the West according to Rav Yochanan's basic reasoning. Why? Because they disagreed with Rav Yochanan. According to Rav Yochanan, understanding of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael said there's a problem because how can the investor possibly acquire a share of the produce when the agent deviates from his instructions? Why? Who notified the owner of the wheat, the seller, that he should transfer part of the wheat to the owner of the money, the investor, and not all of it to the agent? So I'll tell you what it's talking about here, is that it's a case of basically saying that according to Rav Yochanan, he understands Rabbi Yehuda's holding that even when the agent disregards his investor's instructions, the partnership remains intact, so that even if the investment returns a profit, the investor takes half. Because why the explanation previously given is that the purchase was made partly on his behalf, so that the owner owned half the produce, and when it's sold as a profit, he takes a portion of the profit generated by his portion of the produce. But the sages of Eretz Yisrael said it couldn't have possibly happened like that. Why? Because the one selling the wheat to the agent doesn't necessarily know that the agent is acting on behalf of an investor. So when he receives the money from the agent, his intent is to transfer ownership of all the wheat to the agent himself and nobody else. So since the seller's intent, according to the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael, is integral to the transaction, how can the investor acquire a share of the wheat? In other words, according to, this is not secular law, this is Judaic law, that the seller has to have in mind that he's transferring wheat both to the agent and the investor. Now, according to Rav Elazar, he explains that the second brisa calls Rabbi Meir. There's no difficulty. Why? Because Rav Elazar understands that Rabbi Meir is holding that even when the agent disregards his instructions, he's actually not deviating from the investor's will. Because at the end of the day, if he's making a profit, the investor's quite happy that he's his legal representative in the transaction. The only time that he's not happy is when there's a deviation and there's a loss. Because we know this principle of an agent is considered like himself, a person's agent, and therefore it's irrelevant whether the seller knows that there's a silent investor, etc. Why? Because the purchase is being made partly on the investor's behalf. So even if the seller intends to transfer the produce to the agent, the investor is legally represented here by the agent, acquires a share that's due because he's an extension of the investor. But the problem is with Rav Yochanan's understanding, because the brisa follows Rav Yehuda, then the agent is basically deemed to have deviated from the investor's will. And then how can the investor acquire half the produce nonetheless? Okay? Because although the deviation doesn't affect acquisition for the agent, in other words, it's not deemed an act of robbery by Rav Yehuda, the agent is not considered the investor's legal representative. Why? Because it's an unauthorized transaction. So if the seller of the wheat wasn't informed that the investor is a silent partner, how can the investor actually acquire anything? Why? Because if you look at Rav Elazar, he was saying that the only time the agent is not extending the will of the service provider is when somebody's ordered goods or services for their own home, and therefore they don't want a deviation from instructions. But if that deviation from instructions occurs on a commercial level and the investment still makes money, the investor's happy. So at that point, he's not prepared to sever a relationship, whereas when one orders goods or services, they don't want it deviating because it's not profit-based. So according to Rav Yochanan, there's a problem because he doesn't mention about the private and commercial capacity. He merely says that it doesn't acquire an effect acquisition for the agent because it's not deemed to have severed the relationship. Does that make sense? So on that particular basis, there's an objection to that. And who counters it? Rav Shmuel Rephael, who said, look, he doesn't agree with this reasoning of the sages in the West, meaning the sages of Eretz Israel, because he said, look, if that's so, the investor cannot acquire anything unless the seller is aware that the purchase is made on his behalf. So even where the investor sent the agent to buy wheat, and the agent bought wheat as instructed, the investor should also not acquire a share of it, because who notified the seller to transfer part of the wheat to the investor? So all he's saying there is, look, at the end of the day, you can't even have a legitimate transaction on that basis. Why? Because say Gavin and I are in partnership together, but I'm a sleeping partner or a quiet investor. It doesn't matter if Gavin ends up buying some of the products from Arthur and some of the products from Kevin. Whether or not they know I'm involved in the transaction, it doesn't make a difference. Because even if Gavin did follow our agreement and bought the produce that both of us discussed, if that transaction is allowed, and then just because the seller wasn't aware of who the investor is, that's not a good argument, because it doesn't matter. If you take a normal transaction and you go to Monarch Building Supplies and you buy, and there are various partners in the business, building supply company doesn't care who the partners are. All they care is they get paid and they deliver the concrete and the wood. So at the end of the day, Rav Sasriti is basically saying, what difference does it make? Because even if you followed instructions, nobody really cares who their silent investor is. So the answer to that was different, because Rav Abayu is saying, look, in the case of wheat, it's different. Because if the agent is carrying out the agency of the partnership, then he's following instructions. And therefore, because the investor has got the agent working as an extension of him, and they're both on the same page, he's considered as though he's carrying out his agency. So it's different with a homeowner, because if I instruct Gavin and I say, Gavin, listen, I want a beautiful cabinet designed, and Gavin's a carpenter, and he comes back and he gives me a dining room table instead of a cabinet, then at the end of the day, I never instructed him to buy wood for that sort of purpose. And therefore, it matters when the wood was delivered by the building supply company, because quite simply is they never got my sanctioning because it wasn't followed on my behalf. So what we are saying here is there's a heck of a difference between intent of commercial use, where the goal is to make a profit, versus intent of having a customized item in a personal capacity. And that's why, according to this, it would seem that Rav Elazar's got a good point. Okay, so just one thing to note is that basically, in summary, there are two explanations that were presented for the second brisa, which basically rules that the investor enjoys a share of the profits even when his instructions were disregarded. Because Rav Yochanan explained that the brisa follows Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that an agent's deviation does not make him a robber, and hence it doesn't affect acquisition for him, that he can cut the investor out of the picture if he makes profit. He absorbs the loss, yes, because he deviated, but it doesn't mean it severs the relationship in the event of the profit goal is achieved. Rav Elazar basically explains that the second brisa can even reflect the opinion of Rabbi Meir, because it deals with a business enterprise. And the only reason where Rabbi Meir holds that when a business agent uses sound judgment to act independently, he hasn't deviated from the investor's instructions at all. So basically, the critical difference between the two views, that is, according to the first approach, Rav Yochanan, according to Rav Yehuda, when an agent deviates from the instructor's will, the investor remains a partner to the transaction nonetheless, because a deviation doesn't affect acquisition of a physical change. It's not like a private transaction where it was not what was his orders at all. So according to the second approach, Rav Elazar, according to Rabbi Meir, If an agent deviates, he acquires the produce for himself in a personal capacity. But the agent in this case is not regarded as having deviated from the investor's will on a commercial basis. Do you see what I'm saying, guys? Okay. Now, before we go into other aspects, etc., I think we can cut it at this point. I know we're finishing early, but Gavin's got bronchitis. Arthur's trying to deliver goods to his patient, I think, and Kevin is on a mission to get back from Tel Aviv. So I know we're cutting the show like 10 minutes short, but I think we can leave it at this particular point. And then we're going to talk about temple treasury possessions tomorrow and intent of acquisitions. Can't hear you guys. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Thank you, Damon. I actually, I'm going to go to bed now. I'm not feeling all that well. All right. And I'm going to be good for tomorrow morning. So I need to try and get a better night's sleep.
Listen, Kevin needs to teach us for a few minutes. You can just talk to us.
Okay.
No, go ahead. That's
okay. I'm going to a backdrop of one of these old, beautiful shuls in Tel Aviv. So I'm a few minutes away. Just let me get to it. I'll stand from the steps here. There's beautiful shuls.
What size?
Okay.
I have no idea. Which lotion?
Anyway. Okay. Can I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. You always send us these magnificent shuls. Lovely,
This is you actually can't go in. And anyway, so let me just go slow. While I talk, I'll give you a backdrop of this lovely neighborhood here. Okay, so this week's parsha is the start of Vayikra. What's it? Is it Vayikra, Damon? We finished Bahar Bakukotai, and now which is the end of I think Shmot, and now we're on to Vayikra, and so I went over the second parsha. I'm 1 week ahead because I didn't realize the order because of the Pesach anyway. So it talks about all the different tribes brought gifts and for the inauguration of the Mishkan, and it duplicates. It says it repeats. They brought the exact same things: a basin, wash basin. They bought sheep. They bought stuff for sheep and cattle, and a ram for sacrifices. And it seems to be repetitive because it takes about a couple of pages, but it's as I say, the details are very important. And one thing I saw there was it was such a big deal, such a big event. The new Mishkan, or the new, I think it was the new Mizbeach, one of the two. Can't remember the time on the bike. Yeah. So they made sure that they gave the same offerings and exactly the same, and it was they wanted to. It was a big honor to donate to the Mishkan. So what I was thinking, actually, I just thought I had the thought now. So forgive me if it seems infantile. I don't think it is, but I think if we have an opportunity to donate to holy cause like a Haknasat Sefer Torah, to write a letter, if we have opportunity, we should grab it with both arms. We have opportunity to be part of something that's amazing in the spiritual sense. I think that could be a takeaway, which I just thought about now.
I think it's amazing.
Yeah, perfect.
Can you see the neighborhood here? This old neighborhood here, parks and yeah. I just thought of that now. I just say it. Not having the book and they also what they also did. So can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
they did the countings. They did different countings in Vayikra. They do a census of and they do a separate census of the different tribes of Lim. There's Merari, there's Kahat. They're different families within who have different avodot, different tasks to clear the ashes and all sorts of things. They do a separate census of the Levium as compared to the other tribes. There's a special. So Gavin, you descended from Levium, because that's where the Kohanim come from. So that's they regarded in a very, not that we aren't all special, but they did it. They didn't count them with the other 12 tribes. Also because they didn't participate in the Egel Hazav, the sin of the golden calf. So anyway, I hope that's just giving you something on the front. I'm just showing you here nice little old neighborhoods here with palm trees and parks, and I don't know if you guys can see.
Yeah.
And there's some actually lovely shuls in this neighborhood as well. You know, in Israel, and there's a lot of Talmidei Chachamim that live here. It's if you want them, you'll find them. So anyway,
it actually looks